It's striking when you look at history. Every global superpower, doesn't matter how big their military, how deep their pockets, they eventually seem to hit a wall.
Yeah, and few places have been that wall quite as consistently and devastatingly as Afghanistan.
Right. We're talking about a historical pattern here that's just, well, it's staggering. It repeats over nearly 2 whole centuries.
Just think about the list. You've got the British Empire, at its absolute peak, then the Soviet Union, deep in the Cold War.
And then most recently, the U.S. and its allies with technology that's just leaps beyond anything seen before.
Exactly. They all went in with what looked like overwhelming force, and yet every single one eventually pulled back, essentially in failure.
And what's really fascinating, and this is what we want to get into today, is that the defeat wasn't just like tactical, was it? It wasn't just military.
No, not at all. It was deeper. It was, you could say, doctrinal. Their sheer numbers, their advanced tech.
Yeah.
It was systematically, neutralized.
Not by matching tech, but by things like faith, endurance, and the land itself.
Precisely. And that's the core idea we're digging into in this deep dive.
Our focus today is on that strategic analysis, looking at Afghanistan's unique history of resistance and what that means for defense thinking today.
Yeah, and we're drawing specifically from some analysis, particularly insights found in the book The Nuclear Umbrella by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. It offers a really critical strategic take on this.
So our mission, for you listening, is to pull out those key strategic lessons from this long history. We need to look past just the battles themselves.
Right. We need to understand how this centuries-long model of resistance, Afghanistan's model, actually forms the basis for a modern strategy for smaller powers trying to balance against, the global giants.
A strategy called asymmetric equalization. We'll unpack that term.
But first, we really need to frame this right. You hear Afghanistan called the graveyard of empires all the time.
Yeah, it's a common phrase.
But the source material we're looking at suggests that's a bit simplistic. It argues Afghanistan doesn't actually destroy empires in the sense of making them collapse entirely.
Okay, so what does it do then?
It acts more like a mirror, a really harsh, unforgiving mirror. It exposes the false assumptions of invincibility that these big powers bring with them.
Ah, I see. So the failure isn't caused by Afghanistan directly, but it reveals the flaws within the invading power.
Exactly. It shows up the arrogance, the flawed strategies. It proves that just having overwhelming power isn't enough to conquer or hold territory long-term, especially there.
That's a really important distinction. It shifts the focus. The failure is kind of internal to the invader's doctrine.
Precisely. And that leads us right into understanding the pillars of Afghan strategic resilience. Because it's not just about, random guys with guns. It's a whole system.
A defense system that's evolved over centuries, right? Self-sustaining.
That's right. If you look at why invaders keep failing, the analysis points to 3 core factors. 3 things that combine to create a defense system that's just incredibly hard for any centralized power to break permanently.
Okay, let's break those down. The first one seems pretty obvious, but maybe its impact is bigger than we think. Geography.
Yeah, the geography. It's easy to just say mountains, but you're right, its strategic weight is often underestimated.
Yeah.
That terrain, it's just brutal. It's an immediate equalizer.
How so? Equalizer in what sense?
Well, it actively works against a modern mechanized army. Think about it. It gives constant cover to defenders, to guerrillas. But for the invader, it's a logistical nightmare.
Right. Tanks and trucks get stuck in valleys, have to use predictable roads.
Exactly. And air power. Sure, it's powerful, but finding targets that can just melt away into these incredibly complex mountains, these valleys, it's tough. Very tough.
So it forces the invader to use massive amounts of resources, troops, just to control tiny areas or keep supply lines open.
Precisely. It slows everything down. It negates the speed and force concentration that modern armies rely on. It basically hands the initiative back to the local mobile defenders.
So the land itself is practically a combatant.
You could absolutely say that. Then the second factor, this is about the social landscape. Tribal structure and fierce independence.
Okay. How does that play in?
Well, the political terrain kind of mirrors the physical terrain. Afghanistan has this deeply localized, decentralized political structure. Power isn't held in one place. It's spread out among tribes, local leaders, communities.
Which means it's hard to control from the center, whether that center is foreign or even domestic.
Exactly. It's fundamentally resistant to centralized control. So an invader can take Kabul, they can declare victory, maybe even neutralize the official army.
But they haven't actually conquered the country.
Not even close. They've captured a city, maybe a few key points, but the real resistance, it's still out there, intact, because there's no single head to cut off, no central command to decapitate.
So the resistance just keeps popping up locally, almost automatically.
That's the paddle. It regenerates. It makes any attempt to impose governance incredibly frustrating and ultimately futile for the occupier.
Okay, geography, decentralized structure.
Yeah.
What's the third pillar? You mentioned something intangible earlier.
Right. This is maybe the most crucial piece. Belief and endurance.
The will to fight.
Yes. But it's more than just grit. It's often deeply faith-driven, a spiritual commitment to defend their land, their freedom, their way of life against outsiders.
And that provides what? Infinite morale.
Pretty much. It gives the resistance the ability to simply outlast the occupier. Think about it from the invader's perspective. They're often operating under democratic pressures back home, budget constraints.
Political cycles, public opinion.
All of that. They can't sustain the political will or the economic cost for a 20-year fight if the local population is culturally and ideologically geared up to fight for 100 years if necessary.
That endurance gap, it's insurmountable.
Fundamentally. So you put these three together. The unforgiving terrain, the decentralized society, and this incredible belief-fueled endurance.
You get a defense system that just hasn't been broken.
Exactly. And that's why for nations watching this, especially neighbors like Pakistan, this isn't just some interesting history lesson. It's seen as a direct, incredibly relevant strategic mirror.
A mirror showing them how it's done. How smaller powers can potentially stand up to giants.
Precisely. The analysis we're drawing on is clear. This legacy offers a kind of blueprint. It shows how you can balance against rivals who seem overwhelmingly superior in numbers and technology.
So it's about learning to turn weaknesses into strengths.
Essentially, yes. Turning constraints, things like having difficult terrain, maybe less advanced tech, economic limits into actual strategic advantages. Endurance, resilience, asymmetry. You don't try to match the enemy's strength head on.
You negate it. You wear them down.
That's the core idea, the art of attrition and asymmetry.
Okay, to really get our heads around this model, we need to look at the proof. The historical tests.
Right. The analysis highlights three key periods, three different empires testing this system. We should probably start where the modern lessons really crystallize, back in the 19th century.
With the British.
Exactly. The British defeats, spanning roughly 1839 to 1919, three separate wars. And the First Anglo-Afghan War, from 1839 to 42. That provides the foundational story, the ultimate cautionary tale.
The scale of that disaster is just mind-boggling, isn't it? We should probably detail that a bit.
Yeah, it's crucial. The British marched in, aiming to put their own guy on the throne in Kabul, secure their frontier with Russia looming.
A large force.
A substantial force. Around 4,500 actual fighting troops, but supported by a huge column of camp followers, families, servants, workers. All told, maybe close to 16,000 people went into Kabul.
16,000, okay.
But things went sour. Political miscalculations, local uprisings. They were forced into this disastrous winter retreat back towards British India.
A retreat through those mountains we just talked about, in winter, under constant attack.
Unimaginable. It wasn't a retreat, it became a massacre. And the detail that everyone remembers, the one that anchors this whole lesson.
The single survivor.
Dr. William Bryden. Out of nearly 16,000 people who started that retreat, one single European man stumbled into the British garrison at Jalalabad.
One. Just one. It's hard to comprehend that level of destruction for an imperial army.
It was a shockwave. Not just a military loss, but a massive psychological blowback in London and Calcutta. It fundamentally changed how they viewed Afghanistan and the region.
The strategic thinking must have shifted overnight.
Completely. They realized their usual tactics, the ones that worked in India, just didn't apply here. The Afghan guerrilla tactics, fighting on home turf, neutralized their superior training and firepower.
And did they learn? Because there were two more wars after that.
Well, they kept trying to exert control, but the pattern held. The Second and Third Anglo-Afghan Wars ultimately ended the same way the British unable to impose lasting control. Each time they ran up against that same combination. Relentless guerrilla warfare, local unity, often galvanized by faith.
So the first big lesson, solidified by the British experience. Technology and centralized force can be beaten by belief, terrain, and a people fighting for freedom.
Absolutely. It wrote the early playbook for asymmetric warfare. Tech needs a clear target on open ground. Afghanistan just doesn't offer that.
Okay, fast forward about a century. You'd think the next superpower might have studied that history, right?
You would think. But then we get the Soviet invasion, 1979 to 1989.
And the contrast in forces here is, if anything, even more stark.
Oh, definitely. You had, over 100,000 Soviet troops, top-of-the-line Cold War kit, tanks, heavy artillery, overwhelming air power, those infamous Hind helicopter gunships.
Yeah, an army designed to fight NATO on the plains of Europe.
Exactly. Doctrine built for massive mechanized warfare. Hammer and anvil stuff.
And on the other side?
The Mujahideen, mountain fighters. Their equipment, sometimes just old bolt-action rifles, Kalashnikovs, maybe some captured Lear. But what they did have was absolute conviction, unshakable belief.
So how did Soviet doctrine cope with this totally different kind of war?
Poorly. Their strategy of speed and overwhelming firepower, meant for conventional battles, just got swallowed by the Afghan landscape and that decentralized resistance. Using massive artillery or airstrikes to clear an area, the hammer was pointless.
Because the enemy wasn't in a fixed position to be cleared.
Exactly. They'd just melt away. And the anvil, the blocking force, meant to trap the enemy well. There was nothing conventional to trap or block effectively.
That must have been incredibly frustrating and demoralizing for the Soviet soldiers.
Hugely. Especially since the Soviet army relied heavily on conscripts. These were young guys, often fighting far from home, in a war whose purpose was maybe unclear to them.
Compared to the Afghans fighting for their homes, their faith.
Right. The motivation gap was immense. That contributed massively to low morale among Soviet troops, the political fatigue back in Moscow, and ultimately the systemic failure of the campaign.
Now, we can't talk about the Soviet war without mentioning the external support for the Mujahideen. That was crucial, wasn't it?
Absolutely critical. And Pakistan played the central role here. The resistance wasn't operating in isolation.
What kind of support are we talking about?
Everything, really. Logistics providing safe routes for weapons and aid, often funded by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to reach the fighters. Training camps to turn locals into more effective combatants. Intelligence sharing about Soviet movements.
Is it providing a safe haven?
Hugely important. Pakistan hosted millions of Afghan refugees. This wasn't just humanitarian. It provided a base, a support network that allowed the resistance to continue, even when things were tough inside Afghanistan. It prevented the Soviets from just crushing the resistance through attrition alone.
So having that sanctuary, those supply lines that couldn't easily be cut, turned local skirmishes into a sustainable decade-long war.
It did. It sustained the fight. And the end result, after 10 years of grinding conflict.
Another superpower withdrawal.
Total humiliation, really. A strategic defeat. The Soviet Union was effectively bled out, economically drained, military prestige shattered, contributing to the internal problems that eventually led to its collapse a couple of years later.
So the lesson was repeated, but even louder this time. Faith, endurance, external support. They beat numbers and machines again.
Undeniably, with massive global consequences this time.
Which, incredibly, brings us to the most recent chapter. The U.S. and NATO involvement, 2001 to 2021, 20 years.
Yeah, and this period is defined by what the analysis calls the ultimate irony of scale.
Meaning?
You had the largest, most technologically advanced military coalition in human history. Satellites, drones, real-time global intelligence, effectively unlimited funding, fighting one of the poorest nations on Earth.
And yet,
after 2 decades, the outcome was fundamentally the same as 1842 and 1989, a complete withdrawal of the occupying forces, leaving the local resistance largely in control.
okay, let's get specific here. With all that tech drones watching constantly precision weapons, how did the local fighters actually manage to counter that? What were the tactics?
They became masters of asymmetry, finding ways to negate that technological edge and inflict costs both financial and human that the coalition couldn't sustain. The most iconic tool, the defining weapon of that conflict, was the IED.
The improvised explosive device, roadside bombs.
Well, yes, but thinking of them just as bombs misses their strategic impact. They were much more than that.
How so? What did they achieve strategically?
They were a tool of economic warfare, and they crippled mobility. Remember, the coalition's advantage was movement, protection armored vehicles like Humvees, eventually MRAPs, IEDs took that away.
Making roads too dangerous.
Exactly. They forced patrols to move incredibly slowly, cautiously. They mandated spending billions upon billions on developing and fielding heavily armored vehicles, those MRAPs, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles.
So a relatively cheap, simple IED forces the expenditure of millions on a countermeasure.
Precisely. That's asymmetric cost imposition, a constant low-cost threat forcing an exponentially high-cost response. It also created this pervasive sense of danger. No patrol, no convoy ever felt truly safe, even in the most advanced vehicle. That psychological impact is huge.
So it wasn't just about casualties, it was about bleeding the enemy financially and grinding down their operational tempo.
That's the essence of it. And beyond IEDs, they stuck to the classics, hit-and-run tactics, never engaging in a pitched battle where coalition firepower could just obliterate them.
Choose the time and place, strike quickly, disappear back into the terrain or the population.
Exactly. They dictated the terms of engagement, mostly. But perhaps the most potent weapon, especially against modern Western democracies, was psychological attrition.
Wearing down the will to fight back home.
Precisely, making the war feel endless, pointless. Every casualty reported back home seemed random, disconnected from any clear strategic progress. The enemy was never clearly defined, never centralized enough to be decisively defeated.
It's that frustration, isn't it? Trying to fight an enemy that operates within the civilian population, using local allegiances and faith as its network. High-tech surveillance struggles with that.
It really does. The goal for the resistance wasn't necessarily to win battles. It was to make the occupation politically unsustainable for the governments funding it, to exhaust the political will in Washington, London, Berlin.
Which connects back to that idea of strategic resilience. The analysis mentions time and terrain favoring the locals.
Yes, the invaders could, and often did, win tactical engagements. They could clear valleys, hold districts for a while.
But they couldn't stay everywhere, forever.
Exactly. The analysis is clear. Long-term occupation against a motivated, decentralized, belief-driven resistance just proved unsustainable. The moment the cost-benefit analysis back in the foreign capitals tipped the cost of staying outweighed any perceived benefit, the historical cycle repeated itself.
The superpower leaves, the resistance remains, undefeated in that ultimate sense.
That's the pattern.
Okay, so 3 massive historical examples spanning nearly 2 centuries, all pointing to the same conclusion about asymmetric resistance. Now, the crucial step. How does a nation like Pakistan, sitting right next door watching all this unfold, translate these lessons into actual strategy, into doctrine?
Right. This is where observation turns into application. Pakistan, facing its own strategic challenges, particularly larger neighbors, consciously learned from the Afghan model. It became about internalizing that resilience.
Learning how to turn apparent weaknesses, being smaller, maybe less wealthy, having complex borders, into strengths.
Exactly. It's a direct, deliberate mirroring of Afghanistan's model of endurance and asymmetry, finding ways to offset disadvantages through cleverness, resolve, and specialized capabilities.
Can we see this mirroring in concrete terms, like in specific institutions or national structures?
Yeah, the analysis points to several key areas. The most obvious, and perhaps the ultimate example, is the nuclear program.
The ultimate equalizer.
Absolutely. It fundamentally changes the strategic calculus. It negates overwhelming conventional superiority by introducing an existential risk for any potential aggressor. It forces caution, creates a deterrent, effectively equalizing the field through that specific high-impact asymmetry.
But it can't just be about nukes, right? That's a weapon of last resort. What other areas reflect this endurance model?
Another key area is the development of an indigenous defense industry. The focus isn't trying to match rivals tank for tank or plane for plane. That's impossible and unaffordable.
So what's the focus instead?
Self-reliance, developing solutions tailored to local needs and potential conflict scenarios. Things specialized missiles, specific types of surveillance, things that give a qualitative edge rather than just quantitative mass. It mirrors the Afghan reliance on local ingenuity, like building effective IEDs from basic components. It's about quality and niche capabilities.
Okay, nuclear deterrence, indigenous defense. You mentioned a third area mirroring the decentralized Afghan structure.
Yes, the intelligence structure. The idea here is to build an intelligence apparatus that is deeply embedded, highly adaptable, and resistant to being neutralized by taking out a central headquarters.
Kind of like how taking Kabul didn't stop the Afghan resistance.
Precisely. It mirrors that decentralized resilience. If the intelligence network operates with significant local autonomy embedded within the society, it's much harder for an adversary to penetrate or dismantle completely. Many distributed nodes are stronger than one powerful, vulnerable center.
So you take these historical lessons, these institutional developments, and it all comes together under this term, asymmetric equalization. Let's define that really clearly. What does it mean in practice?
Okay. Asymmetric equalization is the core doctrine. It's how a power facing quantitatively superior rivals seeks to create a strategic balance anyway. It's about deliberately offsetting that disadvantage, fewer troops, smaller budgets, maybe less advanced broad technology, by focusing intensely on three key things.
Which are?
Innovation, meaning developing specific high-impact capabilities, often asymmetric ones like missiles or cyber. Superior morale, the unwavering will to fight, rooted in national purpose or belief. And spiritual resolve, which connects to that morale, providing the deep endurance needed for long-term deterrence or conflict.
So it's not trying to play the same game as the bigger power, just with fewer pieces. It's changing the rules of the game.
Exactly. You don't match strength. You create vulnerabilities for the stronger opponent. You find those pressure points where your specific qualitative advantages can inflict disproportionate cost or risk.
Making them think twice or maybe 3 times before starting anything.
That's the goal. Deterrence through calculated asymmetry. And this connects directly to the title of the source material we mentioned, The Nuclear Umbrella.
How does that book frame this whole philosophy?
It basically boils it down to a powerful formula derived directly from observing the Afghan model.
Which is?
Faith multiplied by quality equals deterrence.
Faith times quality equals deterrence. Let's unpack that.
Okay. Faith represents that intangible element, the endurance, the high morale, the long-term commitment, the spiritual resolve we talked about. It's the will component.
And quality.
Quality represents the tangible, innovative element. This could be the nuclear deterrent itself, advanced missile technology developed domestically, a highly effective intelligence network, specialized forces. It's the capability component, but focused on high impact, not high numbers.
So you combine that unwavering will with specific, potent capabilities.
And the result, according to this strategic thinking, is effective deterrence. It forces the potentially stronger adversary into a state of caution, effectively equalizing the strategic playing field despite the numerical imbalance.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, this idea of building resilience using asymmetric means for deterrence, it doesn't just stop at national borders, does it? It seems logical to extend it to alliances.
Absolutely. If self-reliance and resilience are key, then finding reliable partners who share those principles is the next step. Collective self-reliance.
And the source material points to a specific modern example of this.
Yes. It discusses the Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact, framed in the context of 2025 as a direct application of these lessons learned from Afghanistan, but on a larger regional scale.
How does that pact reflect the Afghan lesson?
It embodies that core idea. Relying on distant superpowers, whose interests can shift, is ultimately unreliable. The analysis suggests this pact represents a move towards collective self-reliance among nations with deep, shared strategic and ideological interests. It's about building security from within the region.
A break from the old model of seeking patronage from a global power.
Exactly. A shift from dependency on external powers to interdependence between regional partners. The analysis sees this pact as a strategic division of labor, almost.
Meaning each side brings something specific to the table.
Right. Designed to create a whole that's stronger than the sum of its parts. Pakistan, in this equation, brings its hard-earned institutional experience in asymmetric strategy, its military professionalism, and crucially, the nuclear deterrent, the ultimate security backstop.
The quality and endurance factors, institutionalized.
You could say that. And Saudi Arabia brings its immense economic strength, vital for funding sustained defense development and achieving that self-reliance goal, plus its unique position of spiritual centrality within the Muslim world.
Okay, the economic part is clear. But spiritual centrality as a strategic asset in a defense pact, isn't that a bit unusual? How does that contribute to hard security?
That's a fair question. The analysis argues that unlike purely transactional alliances that can dissolve when geopolitical winds change, weaving in this element of shared faith and spiritual significance actually makes the alliance more durable.
Oh.
It creates deeper buy-in both domestically within both countries and potentially across the wider region. It roots the strategic partnership in something more profound than just shared threat perception. It adds to that morale and endurance factor we talked about, making the alliance more resilient to external pressures or internal political shifts. It reinforces the will component of deterrence.
So combining Pakistan's military nuclear capabilities with Saudi Arabia's economic and spiritual weight creates a more formidable bloc.
That's the interpretation presented. Together, they aim to form a modern fortress of Muslim unity, resilient against external coercion. And this collective structure, importantly, takes on the role of strategic depth.
Strategic depth. Usually that means geographical space, right?
Right.
Room to retreat, regroup.
Traditionally, yes, purely geographic, a buffer zone. But this analysis reframes it.
Oh.
Strategic depth here isn't just about physical space anymore. It's about the resilience created by this unified alliance, ideological, economic, institutional, and military depth. It's taking the core principle of Afghan resistance, which relied on internal unity and belief for its depth, and applying it on a state-to-state level.
So strategic depth becomes about the strength and reliability of your alliances, built on shared foundations, not just empty land.
Exactly. It's a shift from geography to a multidimensional concept of resilience rooted in self-reliance and shared purpose.
Okay, we've covered a huge sweep of history and strategic thought here. From the British defeats 2 centuries ago through the Soviets, the US-NATO war, and into modern doctrine like asymmetric equalization and alliances like the Pakistan-Saudi Pact. Let's try to pull it all together. Synthesize the core takeaways.
Right. The analysis essentially distills decades of conflict in Afghanistan down to some fundamental insights, almost like laws of asymmetric conflict. We can probably list about 5 key ones.
Okay, let's tick them off. The first one, going back to the British and Soviets.
Terrain and faith neutralize technology. Sophisticated weapons and rigid doctrines just don't cope well when faced with complex geography combined with that absolute decentralized commitment from defenders. The cost in blood, treasure, and morale eventually outweighs the tech advantage.
Okay. Second insight, obvious from the sheer length of these wars.
Endurance outlasts occupation. This is pure time warfare. Doesn't matter how powerful the occupier is, if the local population is prepared to resist indefinitely, the occupier's political will back home will eventually crumble. Time is always on the side of the defender fighting for their home.
Third point, relating to how the resistance was organized.
Unity beats numbers. That local, often tribal or faith-based unity, even though it looks chaotic from the outside, proved way more resilient than the invaders' top-down, centralized command structures. You can't just take the capital and win. You'd have to defeat every village, every valley simultaneously. History shows that's basically impossible.
Right. Fourth insight, about what keeps the resistance going.
Ideology mobilizes resources far more effectively than just money or orders. When people believe they're fighting for their survival, their land, their faith, it unlocks a level of commitment and willingness to sacrifice that occupiers, often fighting for limited political goals, just can't match. It creates a potentially endless supply of fighters.
And the fifth insight, the one that's crucial for understanding how they kept adapting.
Adaptability guarantees survival. The Afghan fighters consistently showed an ability to quickly adopt and master new tactics to counter whatever the invaders threw at them. Think of the rapid proliferation and effectiveness of IEDs against advanced vehicles. That constant innovation and adaptation at the tactical level is key to survival in asymmetric warfare. It's about quickly negating the enemy's latest advantage.
5 powerful insights. So wrapping this all up, what's the final overarching conclusion that comes out of this analysis?
It's pretty stark, really. Every single empire that went into Afghanistan eventually left, defeated, or at least forced to withdraw without achieving its aims. They were beaten.
But the lesson?
The lesson from that history, the lesson about resilience, about the power of asymmetry, belief, and endurance that remains undefeated. It's a timeless warning, really, to any power that relies solely on its technological or numerical superiority.
It boils down to that fundamental truth. Power without purpose, without discipline, ultimately fails. But faith, when combined with discipline and smart qualitative strategy, endures.
Exactly. It's a core principle of resistance.
And for nations like Pakistan, and perhaps others observing this, the idea of strategic depth gets a radical makeover.
Yeah. It's no longer just about having land to fall back on. It's about unity under belief, backed up by those specialized asymmetric capabilities. That combination forms the bedrock of this modern concept of self-reliant security.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a really important question to think about, doesn't it?
It does.
If history shows us again and again that massive technological and military superiority can be consistently neutralized, even defeated, by this combination of asymmetric tactics, faith, endurance, and innovation, well, what does that mean for the future?
What adjustments do today's global powers need to make if sheer might keeps proving vulnerable to determined will?
It really forces a rethink, doesn't it, about how military power is used, how occupations are sustained, maybe shifting focus entirely from trying to control territory to strategies based purely on deterrence. A lot to consider there.